views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening. Welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to journalists and editors and writers and photographers and videographers and anybody who's putting stuff out in the borough of the Bronx. And this evening we are getting right in the thick of things. We're going to talk a lot about what happened on Thursday, June 4th on 136th Street and Brook Avenue. Lots of controversy about a protest that frankly turned violent. Many of the people protesting were concerned that police invaded their space and then ultimately whisked them away to jail. And unfortunate for just about every reason you could imagine. It was a Black Lives Matter protest. We're going to use Andom Ghebreghiorgis as a reporter because he was there and in fact one of the people who had been arrested, and he's going to give us his firsthand impression of what he saw. We should say that Andom is a special education teacher who is a former candidate for Congress in the 16th Congressional District. Andom will leave the aborted congressional run for another program, but I know you have some important things to talk about. So I'm just going to let you say what happened on that night, June 4th. What were you doing, and how did it turn out kind of so badly?
Yeah, there was a protest that was organized in the South Bronx. We met at 149th and 3rd at the Hub. It seemed like there was some mutual aid being organized and distributed around the time I got there, which was like 6:45, 7.
When you say mutual aid, what do you mean by that?
So people who were in need of resources, dealing with the pandemic and everything that goes with the pandemic. People were passing out PPE. There was food. There was water. And so that was sort of the scene that I entered at the Hub. I met a couple of people who I didn't even know were going to be at the march there, chatting with them. And we probably started marching around 7:15. And we walked through, so we walked south from 149th and 3rd. We walked through a couple public housing complexes. And we were probably walking for maybe 40 minutes before we were cordoned off by police at around 136th Street. It seemed like I wasn't one of the leaders of the march or anything. I was just there as a participant. It seemed like at 135th Street, we were prevented from entering. There was a line of cops. And so we turned east on 136th Street between Brown Place and Brook Avenue. And so, we're just walking, sort of descending down this slight incline, going down 136th Street towards Brook. And then we just stop. And I'm in the middle of the pack. And I can see ahead of me that there are rows of cops, basically preventing us from going to Brook Avenue.
So when you say cordoned off, they were literally rows of policemen and women in riot gear, and they were standing ready to make sure nobody went any further. In other words, the march stops here.
Yeah, at the time, I wasn't exactly sure what was going to be happening. I saw that we were stopped. I saw that these police officers, were very heavily protected. There were many on bikes who were armored up in ways that I had never seen before. Some people were saying that they looked like Shredder from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Was there any violence? Was there any talk of violence? Was there anybody in the crowd that you felt was going to be violent? Listen, we know there was anger, but was there any suggestion that, this could really turn ugly at some point?
No, I never got that sense. It was FTP, which stands for many things, one of them being F the police, also free the people. If one wants to interpret that as violence, that's up to their interpretation. But certainly, there was no talks of that amongst the people I was around or anything from the organizers. As we turned east on 136th Street, the cops who had previously been cordoning us off or not allowing us to go towards 135th Street, they swooped in from the back And at this point, we had now been essentially kettled and boxed in right there on 136th Street.
And this is prior to the curfew. I mean, I guess everybody was aware there was a curfew, but
Yeah.
this was prior to the stated curfew of 8 o'clock. So it's like 7:30 or 7:40, something like that?
No, much closer. It was maybe between 7:55 and 7:58.
Okay.
And so, me personally, I'm just sort of like, all right, like what's about to happen? I live in Mount Vernon. I'm from Westchester. So I had not been in the city during the time of the curfew. And I wasn't exactly sure if, exactly at 8 something was going to happen or what the actual procedure was around this.
Let me just ask you something. In your perspective, if they had gotten on a megaphone and said, ladies and gentlemen, it's 8 o'clock,
100%.
you would have turned around and said, thank you very much, FTP or whatever you wanted to say, and marched out and gone your merry way. And you had the sense that others would have done the same thing.
I mean, I don't want to speak for others, but me personally, as like I'm not from the South Bronx. I used to teach in the Northeast Bronx. I wasn't necessarily trying to get in a situation where I had to walk 20 blocks to my car and potentially just like be whisked away for breaking curfew. I just wanted to go and show solidarity for an hour, 2 hours. I didn't expect it to happen right at 8 o'clock, but I would suspect maybe half the crowd would have turned around and walked away. But again, that's just totally my personal guess. I have no idea.
And then what happened to you?
Well, so what happened after was really, it was a surreal scene. We basically were chanting and singing from between 7:55 to around 8 o'clock. And looking back at my video afterwards, I saw that at 8:11 is when the cops that were to my back, basically moving west on 136th Street, the ones who had blocked us from the back, they started pushing in. And they were using their bikes, pushing in. I posted a video where you can hear people saying, "You're going to kill us. You're going to kill us," because we were just becoming basically being tightly packed in an enclosed space because there were also cops in the front not allowing us to move. Really, really chilling was the fact that we were also hearing people say, "I can't breathe," which is the exact language which we know of Eric Garner, of George Floyd. And at that point, you're hearing people say, "I can't breathe."
And they actually couldn't breathe. It wasn't like they were chanting a slogan, like they were really meshed in. And then, we saw videos, one of them that you posted, there were police officers using their nightsticks. I mean, I don't know all the technical equipment to kind of beat people up in a way. And then you were literally a police officer came and grabbed you and handcuffed you and detained you?
Yeah, so it went on for a while. At that point, I would say for about 15 minutes, there were initially first 5 minutes, there were people, just police officers doing what you described, jumping onto the hoods of cars, waving down indiscriminately with their batons. Some individuals I saw were being baton checked by police officers. Others were police officers were sort of indiscriminately spraying into the crowd. And so that happened for about 5 minutes. The police then tried to sort of clear 136th Street. Myself and many others, we were waiting on the sidewalk. Many of us waiting on the sidewalk, maybe 50 to 100 people on the sidewalk that I was in. And then 15 minutes after the initial kettling was when I personally was zip tied.
You were zip tied. And then we don't have a ton of time left, but I want to go through it. So you were then detained, put in a van, and as I understood, it wasn't for more than 24 hours that you were released.
Yeah, I was
briefly
detained.
Described what your process was.
It was basically about 19 hours that I was detained. Zip tied, we were placed into the center of 136th Street, taken on a van. We went all the way to Queens, which I was very surprised by. We waited on a sort of never-ending, Six Flags opening type line for hours, and it was just not moving. It was pouring rain. So maybe 4 or 5 hours we waited on a line. Then
in the rain?
Yeah, it was raining for about 2.5, 3 of those hours.
Was there water? Did people have to go to the bathroom or things like that? And happily, I've never been arrested, and I don't know what the normal process is. I realize that people arrested may not be given the greatest considerations, but for that amount of time, for 19 hours, you'd like to think some sense of humanity was addressed.
Yeah, so in Queens, we were not offered anything like that. I personally I had my hands zip tied behind my back for about 7 hours. It was really painful for my shoulders. I ended up being able to have that moved to the front and handcuffed in the front. But many people, they were zip tied for 9, 10 hours and handcuffed, which is very painful for the shoulders. No food, no water. For me, the entire duration, 19 hours, I had no food. Only until we were then moved to Brooklyn after Queens. That was around maybe 4 a.m. There we were offered PPE, we were offered hand sanitizer, offered water. And so that was in stark contrast
A
to what
bathroom
we experienced
chance?
in
I
Queens.
mean, the fear for me
Yeah.
that would be have to go to the bathroom. I'm not sure what you would do,
Yeah, there we were offered the bathroom, but in the end, I was basically 19 hours the whole
I'm going to
ordeal.
give you two scenarios. Let's see. Dermot Shea, the police commissioner, called the activity by the police officers perfect. When there were complaints, Mayor de Blasio said we at City Hall saw something different than you saw. Your comments about those evaluations?
I mean, part of me was just totally surprised because not only did it go against 100% what I saw, but I don't know what flawless execution means when you're literally beating on protesters who are being peaceful, many of them young people, tons of teenagers in the crowd. But then also, like, the reason why I say only partially surprised was because it seemed like the whole act was intentional. It seemed like it was coordinated and premeditated. So it was disappointing to hear that.
Let me. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a criminal justice professional. I have done many interviews like this for a very long time. If the commander on the scene stood up with a megaphone at maybe 5 to 8 and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming on curfew. The law says you can't be on the streets. We're going to give you a path to leave. You got to go." But in solidarity with the notion of nobody should be abused by the police, we're all going to get on our knee together. You can say a prayer, but in silence, in honor of George Floyd, we're going to, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we'll kneel down. And then after we're done, I'm sorry, but you all got to go. We don't want anybody to be arrested. Go. Do you think people would have reacted to that and gone?
Maybe in some other protests or marches. At this one, no. Kneeling was not something that we wanted. It was not something that, well, I should say it's not something that I think is something that is significant or even a symbol that is what I would have wanted to see. And I know from the organizers, hearing what they said prior to what the march, when the march started, that wasn't something that they were looking for. The curfew itself was a sort of act that we don't really agree with. We didn't believe that it was necessary, and we believe it was obviously intentionally. Oh, sorry.
Well, all I'm going to say is, but the law is the law. Mm-hmm. And, from what you're saying, it starts to, I don't want to say justify, but it starts to say, well, the police knew that they had a crowd they weren't going to be able to control, and maybe this was their only way to control it.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things, right? First, there's that famous
and then we gotta go but so just wrap it up with this. Sure.
Yeah. First, I mean, there's a famous quote by Martin Luther King: "An unjust law isn't a law at all." But secondly, I will just say that in terms of the actually arresting people, there's a way to arrest people in a way that is not basically evincing police brutality, in a way that's not exacting police brutality. And in the case right here, we had, as I said before, cops on hoods just indiscriminately waving their batons into crowds. And so, yeah.
Right. Before any warning, listen, we do got to go. I do want to bring on Dr. Darrin Porcher. We thank you for your input this evening. We appreciate your joining us. Maybe we will have a conversation about that race in the 16th when appropriate, but we certainly wish you good luck and stay safe, and appreciate your having your say here on the Bronx Buzz. Andom Ghebreghiorgis.
Thank you. Be well.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, yes, Dr. Darrin Porcher will help us unpack what we just heard, and I'm sure he's got his own point of view as well. We'll be right back.
We're coming out of the other side. So in many ways, from my point of view, we're on the other side of the mountain. You have to be New York tough, smart, united, disciplined, loving. This is the next big step in this historic journey. We talk about being New York tough and what tough really means. We changed the trajectory dramatically by what we did. What we have done thus far is really amazing, and that was smart. But we have to stay smart.
Why should young people care about the spread of coronavirus? Well, we know that people with underlying medical conditions over the age of 60 are at highest risk, but they've got to get it from somebody.
So we're asking everyone to be selfless for others so that we can protect those who are most susceptible.
Not going to bars, not going to restaurants. It all just means physical separation so that you have a space between you and others.
For more information on how you can social distance, please go to coronavirus.gov.
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. A very interesting presentation by Mr. Ghebreghiorgis. And right now, we're going to bring in a longtime friend and commentator who has been on our program before. He's a former NYPD lieutenant, Pace University professor, frequent network news commentator on criminal justice issues. Again, always nice to see Dr. Darrin Porcher. Nice to have you with us, sir.
Gary, as always, it's a pleasure appearing on the show, and thank you for having me as a guest.
So there's so much to talk about with police officers and demonstrators right now. What did you think about what you heard from the gentleman who was just on the program?
I mean, it was an interesting dynamic that he introduced in connection with a protest that subsequently ended with an arrest. But we're hearing it from a micro perspective and not a macro perspective. When I say a micro perspective, meaning this is what his experience was. When I use the term a macro perspective, that's the all-inclusive entity attached to what particularly happened, what preempted the officers to show up at this particular demonstration or peaceful demonstration, as the gentleman mentioned, and was there something else that precipitated the officers to take this type of action? We have to look at what happened on Fordham Road in the Bronx just this week, whereas we had riotous behavior that consumed our neighborhood of the Bronx. And so when we fast forward and we look to what happened in that Mott Haven section, I don't want to say I agree or disagree, but I just think that there's a series of components that need to be introduced into this equation for us to better evaluate or assess the actions of police. I'm a firm proponent in individuals protesting in recognition of the First Amendment rights. When we look at what happened in the wake of the death of George Floyd, it was clearly an example of we need to have reform in policing. So this is merely an outcry from the public to invoke a level of reforms in policing. It's necessary to establish benchmarks and some significant changes. Now, the messaging from the public differs from community to community. I want to say it's more geographic. So it goes back to how this is being done. I think that this is something that we should remain consistent and keep our eyes on the prize and continue the protests in a peaceful manner. And hopefully we can get to the bottom of any misconduct that was committed by any of the officers as a result of the incident that the gentleman just spoke to.
Could the police have handled it differently? In other words, maybe had riot police standing by, not cordoned them off, not kettled them in, handled it in a different way so that people who maybe were thinking of doing wrong could have been isolated, whereas people like the gentleman we heard, who clearly did not come to do anything riotous, could he have been and others like him put in a situation where he wasn't just roped off and arrested? Because really, I mean, we didn't ask him, was he ultimately charged with anything? What was the crime? He says he was standing on the sidewalk watching, and if there was a way to get away, he said, I would have just walked away and left. So I wonder if the police strategy from the outset is kind of right in the center of why they're protesting in the first place.
Well, we have to take in consideration as the gentleman introduced, there was nefarious behavior on the part of the police officers. That's his take. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing that that's what happened, but it goes back to what happened in the earlier part of the week. Mayor de Blasio instituted a curfew of 11 p.m., which was far too late. In the wake of disruptions in connection with peaceful demonstrations and coupled with riotous behavior, it was clear that this should have been a harbinger to introduce a curfew that was much earlier. As a result, we had a public that I should say they, from an emotional state, they acted out in a way that they felt that was appropriate. Some people, the gross majority of people, protested in a sound and peaceful way, but we had a very small group of people that rioted, so to speak. It consisted of destroying property, etc. So how the police dealt with this, I'm hearing one side of information. And from the investigative process, it's safe to say that we need to assemble, or we need to gather the information from protesters, police, and bystanders that were not part of the equation. Therefore, we can make a more comprehensive finding as to what actually happened. Right.
So let me ask you this. The police and the city were embarrassed about what happened on Fordham Road and Burnside Avenue and many other places in the city. Do you think they were caught flat-footed in that case and then were trying to make up for it a few days later? Because as the protests unfolded over the weekend, this was Thursday the 4th, and then when you get into the 6th and 7th, Saturday and Sunday, all the protests that I'm aware of in the Bronx, and there were many of them, were peaceful. And I attended one in Van Cortlandt Park. Police were there, but they were not in riot gear. They were doing, frankly, their job to make sure that things were peaceful. I wonder if, they had a bad memory. They were embarrassed by what happened on Fordham Road and Burnside Avenue. And then in a way, they were overcompensating and overreacting as, they got to other events before they finally have now backed off a little bit and said, well, we realize people are here for peaceful protest.
Gary, that may be quite possible that played into the equation. When we look at Governor Cuomo's statement in connection with how he assessed the mayor and the NYPD's dealing with the riots and the protests, Governor Cuomo specifically stated that this was a subpar response to the disturbances or the disruptions that we had here in New York. So I think that from one perspective, de Blasio may have felt that, wow, you know what? I really didn't handle this appropriately. And the same held true with the NYPD, but the NYPD takes their direction from the mayor's office. So as a result, that may have been the case. But when we look at the quantitative statistics over the last week and a half, we've clearly seen an upward tick of violence in the city, such as shootings, burglaries, and things to that nature. So although we're looking through the lens of one isolated incident, from a more universal perspective in covering the city, we've clearly seen an uptick in crime. So it now gets to the point where how does the NYPD marshal in a society and present a level of calm for us as New Yorkers? I think that it's on a case-by-case basis, because it's not a one fix. It's not a
one size fits all.
Right, yeah, it's not a one size fits all solution that we can apply to what's happening. But it goes back to what I stated earlier. I really feel for the gentleman and his family if he, in fact, was the recipient of police misconduct. But I think the best course of action is for this to be handled within the purview of an internal investigation that can conduct the proper assessment as to who was in place and what action was taken. And therefore, we can revisit this and have a more credible response to the actions, both being positive or negative.
And of course, with the state Senate beginning the ball rolling on repealing 50A, it appears that all of those, all of that information will be public information over time. I want to move the dialogue a little bit, Dr. Porcher. I looked it up, and you were on our program on Bronx Talk, our other program, right after the Michael Brown incident or killing, and
yes,
also after Trayvon Martin. You were there, and we commented on all these things. One of the things that comes up all the time is funding for things like gang prevention and funding for things like after-school programs. I realize defunding the police sounds very harsh, but I think what they're really talking about is taking those monies and investing in those kinds of programs that can, make the need for a larger policing less. And So I'm curious if you think this is an appropriate way to reevaluate budgetary considerations as regards criminal justice in the city of New York.
I'm a strong proponent for a buy-in in connection with a strategy that better helps us as New Yorkers. So if we're looking to fracture the budget for the NYPD, the $6 billion annually that goes to the NYPD, if we're looking to fracture it into gang prevention, youth programs, if we believe a qualitative assessment was done and this would be more fruitful, fine. When we take in consideration what policing is, 90% of policing is service related, 10% is enforcement related. However, that 10% oftentimes takes a disproportionately high amount of that budget. If we can fracture those monies into other causes or entities and it would work for a better police and community relationship, I'm all for it. I'm a strong proponent in police have too many responsibilities. We should bring more professionals into the equation, such as social workers, psychologists, people to that effect, and have those individuals respond on some of the assignments that police respond to. What we can now do is recede officers from those duties and responsibilities and focus them in other directions. So as a result of that, we can take that component of the budget that would have been used for police and award that to the additional entities such as practitioners. And that would probably be the best way that I can see it from a defunding perspective. We're not taking money, we're not removing a budget. This is not a moratorium on policing, but it's simply a redirection of funds for the betterment of us as New Yorkers.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We only got about 30 seconds, Dr. Porcher. I'm wondering what police are saying. Have you talked to any police officers? Have they told you anything of interest? And I will tell you, some of the footage that Andom had posted on his Twitter page showed that police did put black tape over their badge numbers. I mean, all of that. I mean, we got to get past that. At this point, it's like, please don't be doing that.
Surreptitious identification on a police officer's part is an act of misconduct. And as a result of that, it should be dealt with accordingly on an administrative level. This is one of the things that we really need to focus on, keeping officers in line, so to speak. But I know we have a short period of time, and you asked me a question about what is the sentiment of officers. I think it's somewhat bifurcated. You have some officers that are diametrically opposed to any defunding of police, and then you have a second component of officers that believe that this is somewhat abstract, and there hasn't been a real identity in connection with what the defunding of police represents. So that moving forward, it's more of a wait and see approach.
That's what we're going to do. And guess what's going to happen? We're going to invite you back to one of our programs along the way. And maybe when we see a budget, we'll evaluate how that's going. Dr. Darrin Porcher, always great to have you. And your perspective is so important for getting a real picture of what's going on in the borough of the Bronx. We appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks for having me, Gary. As always, it's a pleasure to appear on the program.
Thank you so much. Folks, that's it for the Bronx Buzz. We'll be back Monday night for Bronx Talk. And then, of course, next week with more of the Bronx Buzz. Good night. See you around. Thanks to our producer, Steve Powell. Does a great job. Good night.